So let's break down the AR1 algorithmic reverb from Initial Audio. When you first load up the plugin, this is the default setting that we have here, and it doesn't really matter because we're really going to configure this to each track we use it on. So it's important that we understand what each of the controls does just here for us. So let's start from the top left and work our way along. The very first section we can see is grayed out separately and has two controls in. They're the only two that show up in a slightly lighter color, and they are the size and level of the early reflections. Now the size is effectively the size of the room, how long it takes for the first reflections to return back. So if we were to make a clap, the size is the length of time it takes the first reverberation of that clap to come back to us. So obviously in a small tight room, that's going to be much quicker than in a large open car park. So that is effectively what size is. Now the level is the volume at which those reflections return to us. The rest of the reverb is then those reflections that occur after the early reflections, how reverberative the space is essentially. For example, you can have a very small tight space that doesn't really reflect at all. So that's where the second size control you would bring really far down. However, if you're in say a tiled room, something like a bathroom, we're going to increase the size up here because we're going to get lots of reflections. It's going to last a little bit longer. The width is then going to be essentially the stereo spread that we feel in that reverb. Generally, when we capture a reverb, we're going to do it in stereo so we can really feel the space, because that is how we perceive space. So width gives us that perception, but we can narrow it down if we desire depending on the mix. And then the mix control is whether or not we want all of the reverb effect, or we're making a blend of the sound and the reverb together. If you've got your reverb on a bus, generally you're going to have it to full mix. If it's directly on its own send or on its own track, you're going to have to make a blend between those, and that's what the mix control is really there for. So the pre-delay is the length of time before we start to get that full reverberation. So we get our early reflections back, then the pre-delay is the time before those other reflections start to build up inside the reverb. Bandwidth is now going to be how much frequency response do we get in the reverberation. High frequency is generally lost to reverberation quite quickly, so it's unnatural to get everything back in the full spectrum. And by narrowing down the bandwidth, you can get a feel for different types of materials and how that they are reflective. Dampening is a slightly different effect. You can think of it a little bit like a shelf up on the higher end, just reducing down the high end reflection. See, higher frequency has less energy behind it, so it reflects for a less distance and has less reflection potential in it because it loses its energy faster. So dampening just takes into that effect and takes some of the energy out of the top end, making it feel more natural and letting lower frequencies move for a little bit longer. Generally, modulation is going to depend on the reverb itself. You'll find it's usually a combination of pitch modulation and volume modulation, and then by how much it fluctuates depending on the environment simulation you're after. So on the track I've chosen to use here, I have the AR1 on the drum bus. And the reason I've done this is right at the start of the track are just some very atmospheric drums that help build us into the track. However, without the reverb, they are very isolated and dry and don't give nearly as much feeling as they can by using the reverb on there. So let's have a listen with the reverb engaged. That's how the track starts to build up. Now let's try the same thing, but we're going to mute the reverb send and hear how much atmosphere is lost, even though it's exactly the same thing. And we're just using the reverb to create this atmosphere. I think we can hear it's not nearly as atmospheric. So how would we dial in this? At the moment, it definitely doesn't quite suit the song. It needs to be tailored a little bit. And when we come into the first part of the song, the first verse here, We can certainly hear that the reverb's a bit too long and is slightly off time. So the two things that we would really adjust, we're going to dial back the size of our early reflections. And we're going to dial back the size of our reverb as well, make that quite a bit smaller. And we also want our pre-delay to be a fair bit quicker. At the minute it's giving a little bit of a slap, so we're just going to give sort of 5 milliseconds instead of 10. That seems like a small adjustment, but we've actually halved that pre-delay time. Also, we're going to introduce some more dampening, and we'll see how that fares with us instead. Now at the moment it's over exaggerated in the mix, but that's much better on timing. If I was to reduce the balance now, it's sitting much nicer. Let's just A and B that for comparison really quickly. We can hear very quickly there we've used the AR1 to get a really atmospheric drum feel by sending specific sounds to it and giving them their own space. And the AR1 is designed to work with pretty much any sound you throw into it and give it its own space in the mix. If you use it just on an individual bus like this and just use one instrument type into it, it really helps in give that instrument type its own specific space in the mix. This can be impeccably useful on vocals, or in my case drums, where you want them to have their own atmospheric feel in the rest of the track. I hope that video was useful for you guys, and it's a fantastic introduction into what the AR1 can do, but it's best if you have a look at the plugin yourselves and really experiment with it in your mix.